Perhaps there's been a turning point in Newcastle United season at a really crucial time, ahead of the winter and of course the January transfer window. In this video I'm going to be answering your questions on incomings, outgoings and the general picture heading into January. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to another video. Apologies for the lack of match reaction and analysis over the last couple of weeks. I'm back to answer your questions on the January transfer window. I asked for some this morning in quite a scattergun way, typical of me, but thankfully got quite a few back, so I'll get into them in a minute. But before we do, please continue to like, share and subscribe to the channel. As always, more content coming in the new year on different things. A podcast is on its way. I'm just setting all of that up in terms of the co-hosts and the topics. So thanks so much for all the support, but please can you continue, and let's hopefully get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the season. But yeah, thank you so much for all your support throughout 2024. It's been a really great year for the channel, my first full year on YouTube. Exponential growth beyond what I was aiming for, but can we capitalise on it next year? That's really what I'm aiming for. But yes, we are going to be talking January transfers in this video. First one is from Carl, who asks, do Newcastle United have any money to spend in the window? And that's a simple question with quite a complex answer, because yes, of course they do have money. They have the richest owners in the world. That's obvious, but they do have so many things in the way in terms of PSR and all of those things that we're all familiar with, stopping them spending what they want. It has to be on the right player. The issue I had in the summer was that it felt like PSR was solved after Elliot Anderson and Yankuba Minter went out the door in June. They then bid for Michael Olise, Mark Gahey and reportedly Anthony Elanga at different points beyond that before the window closed. And there was a sense that that was the budget. Newcastle had around 50 to 70 million pounds to spend on a player that would enhance the squad without too many fears and issues with PSR. It then transpired later that if they had signed one of those players, they'd be under a lot of pressure in January to maybe sell ahead of that PSR deadline next year, and there'd be a clamour again similar to last year, when I think really that was the sort of starting point of this difficult spell that Newcastle have been in off the pitch, in terms of Amanda Staveley going a few days after that. You know, the players have not been particularly happy with the way that it was dealt with, the fact that everyone seemed to have their price, and it was very much, they were talked about like commodities. And given that everything that Newcastle has built over the last 3 years has been on a foundation of connection, togetherness that Eddie Howe and Staveley, as I mentioned, have built, that was a real shame, and that they really want to avoid that. So in that sense, they have to be very careful this year. Does it mean that necessarily they have to they can't sign anyone? I do think they have to sell first. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to sell a big star first. That's why we're seeing Sean Longstaff, I think, is very much up for a possible transfer away from the club because he's pure profit and an academy product. Miguel Almiron's been touted about for 18 months now, pretty much. Kieran Trippier, there's a question on him coming later, but they are sort of names that are being mentioned in terms of possibly going. But that kind of has to happen, I think, for a signing to happen without any issues. Having said that, Newcastle made the decision with Mark Gahey to go for him because they believed he was a necessary upgrade that would be worth dealing with the consequences a little bit later. So the right deal could be out there, and it's always been the way that Newcastle acted. If the right deal is there, they will act. But they have to, I think, change their sort of approach of what the right deal is, which I'll get into a little bit later. But I don't expect Newcastle to be spending 60 or 70 million pounds on any individual players in January. I hope that answers the question. The second question comes from How Way, which I really like, a name on Blue Sky, who says, do you think Mitchell's comments in the summer point towards going for gambles on youth prospects, a few signings in key positions across the squad between 15 and 25 million pounds in the hope that they could come off like Trafford and Johan Bakayoko, for example? I think the comments that I think that this question is referring to are Paul Mitchell saying that the transfer policy pre him was not fit for purpose, and that sort of jarred quite a bit at the time. But since, I think a lot of people have maybe understood what he's trying to say. And yes, I do think the answer to that question is you'll see a lot more youthful signings, you'll see a lot more players for cheaper prices, and boxing clever in the market, if you like, a bit more coming this January and in the summer and in the future generally. Yohan Bakayoko is a really interesting name that was mentioned in that question. James Trafford's a long-term target, seen as a sort of successor to Nick Pope, who can play with the ball at his feet a bit more, which has kind of always been Nick Pope's issue. But Bakayoko's a really interesting player because he was somebody I mentioned on the transfer show on True Faith last summer. I've spoken to some people around him and some people at PSV about him over the last couple of years. I interviewed his predecessor as the sort of star man at PSV, Cody Gakpo, who left for Liverpool in January 2023. Bakayoko's really picked up the mantle in terms of goals and assists since then. He's very intelligent, very good physical player. He would really fit Newcastle, but more in terms of his profile as well as his particular qualities. Being 21, 22 years old, a player who can grow with the club. I don't think Newcastle can afford to be going and buying more Sandro Tonali's, Alexander Isak's, that type of player at the moment because of this PSR issue. And I don't think that that's likely to be the case even if they have to sell one of those players. That's what I would warn against. I think the ability to sort of attract those players when the project was just starting and there was lots of excitement and lots of no barriers in place, I think it's a lot more complex than that now. They were talking when they, for example, when they convinced Sven Botman to go and leave Lille for Newcastle instead of AC Milan, it was off the basis of we'll get into the Champions League. Of course they did that, but we'll win titles as well. I think that's a little bit more of a harder sell at the moment. So maybe they'll look for players and in markets that are a bit more untapped. The Eredivisie's still got a bit of a cloud around it, but Yohan Bakayoko is one of those really exceptional players. And I think he is a sort of prime candidate for the type of, if the deal's right, then they'll go for it. 18 months on his contract as well. He wouldn't break the bank. But this is kind of the point I've made around transfers. I did a whole video on alternatives to Mark Gahey last summer. They bid 50, 60 million for him when he isn't on the level of either Sandro Tonali or Alexander Isak, but they are the only two players in Newcastle's recent transfers that cost that much. They didn't look at the sort of 30, 40 million pound market, which you would imagine, I think that's what PSV are asking for, and they could probably get a deal that's better than that, I think. So generally, yes, I do think that there will be more streamlining, more clever boxing in the market, whether that's Bakayoko, who's quite an established player in not a high profile league, but he's well known across Europe, and then maybe even players like Yankuba Minte who were completely unknown. I think you'll see a lot more of that because that's what Newcastle have to do. If you look at Aston Villa, for example, £15 million on Morgan Rogers, that looks like an absolutely brilliant deal. Dean Huyson at Bournemouth is a centre-back who was linked heavily with Newcastle last summer, went to Bournemouth for £15 million and is really impressing for Andoni Iraola. This is the sort of thing I'd expect to see Newcastle trying to do. And that is no bad thing if you can keep the spine of the team that's already in place, because I don't think they'll be able to replace the quality even if they sell one of those players. I don't believe personally that another player will come in of that level. I just think that it's a harder sell now. Newcastle aren't quite in the position that they were when they brought all of those players in. Bruno aside, obviously, who came in when they were in the relegation zone. But it does feel like that is the way forward. And as I say, that is no bad thing. When you look at the spine of the team that is Champions League quality, you add young, exciting players who've got a point to prove to that. That's quite an exciting prospect, in my opinion. Next is James. Are the Tonali back to Milan rumours nonsense? Even got a mention on Match of the Day. Seems unlikely. But could there be a clause that says they can take him back for a fee if he wants to go? I don't believe there's a clause. I don't think that there's anything to suggest that there's a clause, James. But these rumours, I can understand why they are frustrating Newcastle fans. His agents come out and said that he's very happy at Newcastle. He's come out and said that he feels like he owes Newcastle because the club stood by him during his difficult time with his ban as well. So, yeah, I think that this is not likely to happen. Newcastle would demand a big fee to even consider it. He's got 4 years left in his contract, so that's a positive as well. Establishing himself, we've spoken about him so much on this channel and across other Newcastle United media in recent weeks. Started and played the most minutes over the last 3 or 4 games. Absolutely paramount that he plays at number 6 now. It feels like that problem has been solved, so it would make no sense for Newcastle to cash in on him or allow him to go. And at this stage, because he's only just finding his feet, I think he feels like he owes Newcastle. His agents come out and denied it, and I don't think Milan can actually afford that sort of deal at this stage, in January at least. Maybe the summer would be different in terms of their affordability, but I don't think it makes it any more likely for the reasons I've just outlined. Andy says, we aren't signing anybody, are we? And then James came back to that and said, how many YouTube skill compilations will I watch of players we will not sign? Well, that's up to you. Honestly, James, Newcastle can't do that much for the reasons I've already, as I said, just mentioned. Because of PSR, because the market is volatile. Great that they do, for example, like Johan Bakayoko, and that does seem to have legs, because that's an ideal sort of signing. Before you watch skill compilations, James, I think the reality is Newcastle are more likely to sign nobody than sign somebody that they don't necessarily need. So, and I think that this is a window where it could possibly be that nothing happens either way. And I do think because something has to happen maybe out first, and again I stress that that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be Bruno or Isak or Tonali as mentioned in the last question. It could be Almiron, it could be Longstaff, that type of player. That probably has to happen first, so the likelihood, if that doesn't happen, of somebody signing is quite remote. So I think I would warn against watching too many compilations on YouTube. Just watch my videos instead. That's what I would suggest. Razor, not Matthew Raisbeck, says, will it be a blank screen of silence? It's sort of building on the last question. Can't see us doing anything in January. Might even not allow somebody to go if taking Eddie at face value. There's nothing I can add that I already haven't said to this question, but what I will say about Eddie Howe and the way his press conferences work are very, very calculated. He doesn't actually say that much in either direction, and I'll point you to the Miguel Almiron press conference at Hull that I was actually at in the summer, in the pre-season, when he said that he was asked directly about Miguel Almiron's future, and he was very complimentary of his attitude and working with him in training, and said he was looking forward to that, but he didn't say anything about his future. He said a lot of things in past tense. He didn't make any comments about what was going to happen with his playing career and what, how many minutes he was going to get. And as it's transpired since, he's got very, very few, and he is very much available for transfer this summer. So I don't think that nothing will happen. Of course, sales have to be right, though, and I've pointed this out in previous videos and on social media myself. When people were sort of really clamouring for Miguel Almiron to go to Charlotte FC, for example, last summer for about £5 million, it would have made absolutely no sense, because that can't change anything for PSR reasons. So the sales have to be right, just as the signings do as well. And if the right price comes for the right player, more likely, as I say, Longstaff, Almiron, squad players like that, I don't think that they're going to be open to selling a key player in January. But an offer for a squad player that gives value for Newcastle in the transfer market will be considered very much so. So I think that it's possible, but I do think there's more likely to be an exit than maybe a big end rival, for example. It's a second question from Carl next, and he says, with the reliance on Alexander Isak's performance, is it short-sighted to not have a second striker? Most teams do have two good options. And yeah, this is a really difficult one, isn't it? Because Newcastle have had to sort of manage. I think it shows for me where Newcastle are with PSR and the whole difficult thing, because it's a bit like whack-a-mole, because they do need a second striker who can come in and replace Isak, with Callum Wilson's fitness deteriorating and chances of staying and playing more games for Newcastle deteriorating by the week, it seems, as well. They do need a second striker. They also need a right winger and a centre-back and a goalkeeper by the sounds of it as well. And they only have so much they can do because of their restrictions. That's where the restrictions really come in, is the big picture stuff. So you kind of have to pick your battles. And as a result of this, they tried to box a bit clever with Asula, but Asula's not quite ready to step into Isak's shoes. It's very much like Lewis Hall take two in that sense. But the answer to the question is, it is very much an issue. Newcastle do need a second striker who can come in. And I did a whole big thing on Jonathan David last summer with Steve Caldwell. I think he'd be an ideal signing with his contract running out in a few months' time. But there's going to be a lot of interest across Europe. There'll be a heavy amount of wages that will go on him and that sort of thing. So Yes, to answer the question, it is short-sighted, but it's a question of picking battles, unfortunately. Would you rather have a second striker come in to back up Isak rather than a first-choice right-winger or a first-choice centre-back? This is the sort of question, unfortunately, that Newcastle do have to answer at this stage. So I don't imagine that that's going to change in this window, personally. But I could be proven wrong. Steph asks, if it is sell to buy, will Eddie Howe allow Kieran Trippier to leave? And yes, I think I've already kind of answered this. I think that there are a bunch of players who are sort of silently available for transfer. Almiron, Sean Longstaff, Dubravka would be absolutely out the door to Saudi Arabia from Newcastle's perspective if Nick Pope weren't injured now. January's kind of been like a really sort of interesting part to take stock in Kieran Trippier's importance to Newcastle. The 1st January 2022, obviously he signed as the standard bearer, the face of the new project. He then signed a new deal a year later as the player who was really driving that leadership role and doing really well with the club going forward. Last season there was his form was dipping and Bayern Munich came in and there was a real crossroads moment. He ended up staying and lots of fans were kind of split on that. Now I think it's at the point where he wants first team football. His leadership is not as vital to the club. It's not driving the club as much as it was. He's not playing regularly anymore. He isn't. The team has kind of moved on. As much as he still offers something and still is one of the best servants in my lifetime, watching Newcastle as a fan and a journalist and speaking to him as well. He's absolutely amazing footballer, an amazing person for what he's done for Newcastle. But it now feels like this is the point in this 4th January at the club that perhaps now is the time to be considered that he would leave. And yeah, I do think that he might well be on the way out this January, but it does have to, as I said earlier, suit Newcastle. It won't be £15 million from Bayern Munich, but also he's not going to sign a new contract, so I think that there could be scope for him to leave in the January window, just as I think if Callum Wilson wasn't injured for the whole duration of the window, he would be in the similar sort of position. And the final question is from Johnny, who says, what's Paul Mitchell been up to basically over the last few months since those comments, since that summer? What's the difference between now and then? And has he hired or fired anybody? What's the sort of internal investigation? I think I sort of alluded to this earlier with the question about the youth structure, the different direction in terms of Newcastle's recruitment. But I don't think he's hired or fired anybody. The scouting system has obviously grown, as was mentioned by Johnny in his question in the comment section of my last video. Dan Ashworth grew that scouting system. It all has it's all built, but Paul Mitchell is taking it in a different direction. He's taking more of a hands-on recruitment role. He's since said it was a mistake for him to sort of come in halfway and not really know what he was doing. I think he tried to have too much of a say, I think he said, and perhaps he should have just let the chips fall where they may. And Newcastle, to me, last summer, my biggest issue was that they didn't really know what they wanted to do and ended up doing nothing. They need to have a defined idea of what they want to do now going forward. And that's exactly why Paul Mitchell's here. He's more of a recruitment guy. His record is more about signing players from Europe and finding good deals and being more an ideal for PSR. He's obviously had some good sales in his past as well. So there's lots of things that he's done in the past that suggest that he could be... He is still very much going to be an asset to Newcastle, but he needs to be more defined in what he does going forward, I think, for me. And I think that's what he will do. I think that's what he's been working on over the last few months to answer the question. He has been looking at the way that Newcastle have worked. I think his comments about the transfer policy up to that point have been proven more right since, because it's been 2 windows since Newcastle have made a player signing of a first team player in terms of somebody who's going to really impact the first team. I think they would like to do that in January, but the situation has to be correct without putting themselves under too much pressure next summer before June 30. So it's a really delicate balancing act, because obviously if they don't qualify for Europe this season as well, then the chances of those big players wanting to go next summer grows. I think this is a crucial point for Newcastle going into the window, and whatever happens, Newcastle need a structured way of moving forward. That's what I think Paul Mitchell's been working on, and it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. thanks so much for joining me on this video. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to my thoughts and listening to me answering your questions. If you have any more, drop them in the comment section below. Let's keep the conversation going. Like, share and subscribe as always. Happy Christmas, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.